Welcome to At the Table with AACC, or the Asian American Christian Collaborative. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian pastors and leaders are able to draw from their experiences, their expertise, and their education to discuss questions and issues that impact the Asian American Christian community at large, and most specifically, the church. We're here today at the historic Chinese Community Church of Washington, D.C., located in the heart of Chinatown in our nation's capital. The church was founded in 1935 and is the only Chinese church in D.C. proper. I'm so glad to be with our special guest. And we're here to talk about discipleship and cultivating Asian American identity, the significance or lack thereof when it comes to discipleship, and the ethnic and racial identity development of Asian American and Asian American Christians more specifically. Great to be with you all.
Great to be here.
So I want to open this up to everyone, and every question is for everyone, but what does it mean to be Asian American?
Well, let me take a stab at it. It's a compound word, right? Asian American, so we have to do justice to both terms. I think Asian means somebody who identifies with the Asian heritage. Any part of Asia, it's also very diverse, but Asian heritage identifies with the Asian ethnicity. And then American, they identify with American culture. For me, that's what it means, Asian American.
I struggle a bit with the term, to be honest, just because, as John mentioned, Asian is a key part of what we're identifying with, Asia, and as even my young children will point out, Asia is a pretty big place, and so that term is really attempting to sort of bring together a wide, diverse population, both here at home in America as well as abroad overseas, where most of these communities originate from. And so just to start off with a note of the complexity of that term, and yet I think it's a powerful one. I think it's one that we need to reclaim and redefine, first for ourselves as well as for the public. I think Asian American, on top of what John has already mentioned, also has a note of unrecognized marginality. And what I mean by that is that Asian Americans, despite the large size population-wise, is a term that refers to a people that are distinctly foreign in their identity, not originally from here. We present as such, even in our physical appearance, can't hide that. And also, however, that difference is unrecognized. A lot of people in this country see us as being oftentimes fully assimilated, fully empowered, fully okay, and yet that's often not the case.
Yeah, I think in addition to some of the anthropology, sociology, some of the different sciences, I think one of the ways I've tried to help people even in our church understand this idea is part of God's creative intent and design. And maybe I'm probably reflecting some of my own trauma growing up, where I used to see it as something to have to compensate for, something that was a negative in my life, and now I'm going to prove I'm beyond just being Asian American, whatever we define. But more and more to be able to see it's part of where God wants to fully help us be all that He intended for us to be, and it's not a mistake. It's actually very carefully crafted by the Creator, and something to celebrate, not in itself, but how God is also going to help us to be fully human in a sense.
And obviously, you know, you're Chinese, we're Korean. Koreans make up the largest population within kind of the evangelical Christian makeup of the Asian Americans. We're about a third of all Asian American evangelicals. There are, as you mentioned, so many more ethnicities within the Asian diaspora that aren't represented even in this conversation, and so there are limitations to what we're saying. And yet there is this kind of notion that the Asian American term does bring us together as an umbrella term around a variety of factors, including social activism, around kind of political engagement, and around our racial identity. I love what you said about the compound nature of like the words, and like how the two combined creates a completely different entity. It's kind of like butterfly, but you know, it's not really butter, or it's not a fly. It's a different entity in and of itself. And then to kind of address the complexity, I think that, like, to dive into that would probably be a whole conversation in and of itself. So we acknowledge our limitations and our clearly Korean bias in this particular panel, and hopefully we will do justice to the broader diaspora where it's possible. Now, one of the questions that I think a lot of people ask, especially as I go around and just kind of have some like heart-to-heart conversations, is like, what does it actually mean to be an Asian American Christian? Like, is there something unique about being an Asian American Christian? If so, is it just the way we look? What is it? What makes Asian American Christians Asian American Christians?
I mean, it's hard. You can tell it's hard enough to have a very clear or narrow definition of Asian American. It has so many layers, and it is underrepresented and unrecognized in many ways. So we have the burden of bearing that unrecognizability or invisibility, some call it. And then you throw in Christian. So now you add a third ingredient. And how does all this, if you think of an analogy of cooking something, you've got one ingredient, another ingredient. People have never maybe combined this in these two ways. And now you add a third one. I think it can bring more confusion on one hand. That's the challenge. But in my experience, I think that third ingredient can also be the one that creates stability and unity. Because when you have, as a Christian, this is transcultural. Right? It's transnational, translingual. It's the people of God, and God who created all of it. So I think as complex as Asian American is, and as difficult as it could be, but having the Christian identity has the potential, and I don't believe everybody's worked this through, has the potential to actually create some sort of peace or melt it together. So you can personally accept it, even if other people have trouble accepting it. But I think it begins with you being able to accept how these things work together in your own life. Because if you don't have peace or health in terms of knowing who you are, you're not going to be able to do a good job as a pastor or communicate this to other people. So it has a lot of potential to go wrong, but it also has great potential to actually bring the wholeness because of that Christian aspect.
Yeah, I think it's tricky because I don't know if you guys have all experienced, sometimes if something happens that's related to Asian Americans or Asian American Christians, sometimes you'll be asked, so what's the Asian American Christian view on that? And it's like, I mean, you're talking about a wide, like, diaspora of people. So I think it's a tension of realizing maybe we do represent, but also giving space to maybe broaden the understanding of what it does mean to be Asian American Christian. Because I think oftentimes, especially outside of certain tribes, people have a very narrow understanding of what it means. And, you know, if we go by certain stereotypes, maybe a little more heady or stoic and, you know, I got a big mouth. So sometimes people get confused, like, is that how other Asian American Christians are? I'm like, well, it's bigger than probably we've recognized or what we've been taught to believe.
That's great. I think, what does it mean to be an Asian American Christian? I think it means to be an Asian American Christian is to be a gift to the American church. I think there's a lot that Asian Americans have to contribute and to bring to just Christian identity more broadly, and understanding of what it means to follow Jesus here and now. I think it's hard to talk about Asian American Christian identity without also exploring the immigrant experience. It's a defining feature of it, so it's not just racial cultural difference, it's actually that immigrant experience that really shapes a particular subset of American Christians' experience of suffering, experience of cultural difference, and how that shapes identity. It even spans a lot of difference across generations. So that needs to be a part of the conversation as well, whether one is a first generation Asian American Christian or a second generation Asian American Christian, and even exploring the very distinct identities that have been shaped by those different immigrant experiences. So it's to be an Asian American Christian is a rich, complex, full identity that needs to be unpacked and understood better. I think starting with ourselves, right? I don't know that we know ourselves exactly what we mean by that term before we even try to define it for the watching world. That's why these conversations are so helpful.
That's good. And I hope that there's space to disagree like this. Right. So like if you guys want to push back or challenge each other and say, I don't know about that, or my research is saying this, or my experience is saying that, like it would be good to integrate those things, because I do think that because we don't share common language, I mean, the three of us might share common language, but we don't share a common language within the, I think, over 50 ethnicities that are represented within the Asian American umbrella. The countless number of languages, and then even within the ethnicities, there are ethnicities within every country, right? That the trans-Pacific realities are impacted by, as well as the countries of the individual countries in Asia that are processing through. And so this is great, and I think this is also one of those conversations we can have another hour of conversation on, or hours, or even a whole course, which is why so many schools have ethnic studies, and you can study Asian American realities for your whole tenure at school.
I think in some ways it almost goes back to the first question you're asking, what does it mean to be Asian American? Because I know conversations like this, it's beautiful, but it can also be painful for some who feel like, well, you're not talking about my voice or my experience, even within what the outside might seem as the same people. It's so different, and I think it necessitates this, but it requires that cultural, emotional intelligence to be able to recognize it's limited, but hopefully in a redeemed way, it can broaden the sense, even as other ethnic groups have been discovering what does it mean to be Black or Latino, what does it mean to be Asian, but redeemed in our faith. I think it's a beautiful opportunity.
That's good. So, how does the journey of Christian discipleship intersect with the process of cultivating a distinct Asian American identity? Are there any inherent conflicts or harmonies? I mean, we kind of touched on a little bit, but I feel like is there a connection between discipleship, Christian discipleship, and Asian American identity development? Where they converge, diverge? Where are we seeing it happen? Where are we seeing it lacking?
I like to use analogies. So maybe in terms of both Asian American experience and discipleship, the Christian aspect, maybe the imagery of journey can tie the two together. Discipleship is a journey. You're walking with the master, right? So that in itself is a journey. And does the journey ever stop? No. Does it have setbacks? Yes. Does it have times for growth? Definitely. I think likewise, Asian Americanness is a journey. None of us has fully encapsulated, even for ourselves, let alone for our children or church members. I can't tell the story of another member in my church. I can only tell my own story. And my own children have to tell their own version of it, because there are so many factors involved. We live in a very complex Asian world and a very complex American world, and try to do all this together. You need a supercomputer to parse everything. But I think what we can do is tell our own story, and that is a piece of the diamond in the whole jewel. But that's all it is. You can't say I got the whole diamond, but I've got the whole crown. I've got a part of it. But even that's very useful, because our discipleship is also very unique. But if it's a journey, then there's no pressure to have to arrive at a certain place at a certain time. Like, this is it. Because when you arrive at one place, there's some other place you have to pursue and go. So it's full of mystery, but hopefully we are willing to go on this journey rather than just abandon the trip. Because you will discover so many things about you and others as you faithfully go on this trip. And you can learn from other people who also, I think Black or African American brothers on their own journey. Hispanic Christians also on their journey. They're walking. So we can learn from each other. So I think as long as we see that it's a process and full of discoveries and wonder and not give up, I think we can make progress.
I mean, I think the first place where discipleship and identity formation, identity development intersect is by acknowledging, or at least stating, that one's personal identity journey needs to be a part of their discipleship journey. And I think that's something about the Asian American Christian experience that needs to be explored and unearthed, and that is that I think for a lot of us, we grew up having experiences as a person in a racialized world, and yet that was never actually brought into the process of spiritual formation. That was never part of the community conversation. That was, I mean, maybe with friends on the side, you might complain about a racist experience, or you might talk about the struggles, unique struggles that you have in communicating with your parents as an immigrant family, those kinds of things. So it happens, but it's not central to what the church prioritizes as far as the kinds of conversations that we need to have, or the kind of unique struggles that an Asian American faces that the gospel alone can actually speak into, that Christ alone is actually the centerpiece of, right? So it's not a fully integrated experience, rather it's bifurcated. Your Asianness is over here, left for you to kind of fend for yourself and figure out for yourself. And then over here is following Jesus, which is almost stripped of cultural particularities in the way that you are called to work out what it means to be a prayerful, hurting, faithful follower of Christ. So first, just to say, bringing those together in a more full, integrative kind of manner in the life of the church, I think is an important thing that we need to do better with and do more of.
It's so good, and actually kind of related to both of what you were saying. And this has been a journey for me, because I think my background is more heady when it comes to church, and so even discipleship is very content-oriented, information-centered, which is good. We want good content, but more and more, like part of our process in our church is the past as part of spiritual formation. Things like life mapping and other practices to help people to dig in some of their past. And I just think in larger evangelical culture, we're just not very good with the past. We don't have much theologies around it, but like Duke was saying, we have to be able to understand that to know where God is meeting us now, but also leading us in the future. And I know for our Asian American folk in the church, that's something some of them have never done. And to be honest, sometimes they'll push back. They're like, well, just give me the information I need to go to be a solid Christian. I'm like, if you want to get there, you need to know what's framed you to where you are now. And I think really even some of the past couple of years with the rising recognition of some of this Asian hate and just nationally, I think for some of our people, what they saw was some of the past was getting unearthed in ways that they weren't understanding what was happening. But there were things in their past that had formed them, whether they had acknowledged it or not. And now how do we help the gospel to speak into those things and see it as part of God's great design, and that your Asian Americanness, you can't deny that it's part of who you are.
That's good. Now, we're all talking about, how we reconcile our Asian American identity with our Christian identity. And I think, maybe more than any other racial group, we're constantly struggling with that, because for so many of us, for a variety of factors, whether it's the pressures to assimilate, both internally from within our family, who didn't want us to speak our native tongues or our mother tongues out in public, to the lunchbox moments where I always wanted to take cucumber kimchi, oi kimchi, to school, but my parents would never let me, because they were like, people are going to be offended by the smell. And I was like, have you smelled casserole sometimes, or this and that? Like, it's not much better. I'm like, it's a different type of pungent.
Cheese in a lunchbox ain't so great either, man.
Yeah, like when you first open that Lunchables and that you get that weird chemical ham smell, I was like, I'd rather eat kimchi,
Yeah.
you know? And so like, you know, so like we all have moments where we're like, okay, for some reason, Asian is bad, Korean is bad. Like you can be Korean in the home, you can be Korean in your immigrant church, but not out in public.
Yeah.
And that shapes the way that you view yourself, you view your own community, kind of talking about what you mentioned earlier, Dan. But I'm like, I wonder what historical, cultural, or societal factors have, in your minds, have influenced the relationship between Asian American identity development and Christian discipleship? And how can these factors be navigated to foster a healthy sense of self? Because I think we do operate with the sense of deficiency as being born Asian and racialized as Asian, even though we're not born Asian American, we're made Asian American. To lead to a diminished sense of self, which leads to a diminished sense of the imago Dei within us, and then our spirituality or Christian formation and growth.
Well, I think we have a real challenge because Asian nations in general are not that Christian as by heritage. And American tends to overlook Asians. So as an Asian American Christian, we don't have, maybe the Koreans have a little advantage here because there's so many more Koreans, but you try to plumb the depth of Asian culture. There's not a lot of Christianity there, unless you may be Filipino, Catholic, or Korean Presbyterianism. China, what Christian heritage is there to speak of? They're being repressed. And then in America, we are ignored, invisible. Discipleship material I grew up with, using by the major Christian publisher, none of it is all content. It just assumes that if you know the content, the doctrines, you don't need to deal with your particularity of ethnicity. But that was a gross oversight because it's actually colored by this thinking that it doesn't matter. We're all homogenized in America, melting pot, so it doesn't matter. But I think it does matter. But it's going to take minority to say that it matters because we're the ones that can see where it has not impacted us, right? And we have been deficient in terms of our discipling, number one. And then the Asianness in general doesn't help. So we've got a double barrel that we have to push against. So I don't blame if Asian Americans have a trouble because we're not getting a lot of help from the Asian side. We're not getting a lot of help. We have to kind of discover on our own. So it's that's the reality. So it is, this conversation and this kind of journey is so necessary because nobody's going to do it for us. And I think there's an awakening, but a lot of the work's going to have to be done by ourselves.
And I think that's totally right in that there aren't enough resources, and the diminishing of our Asian American identity on the Asian side or Asian American side, and then kind of the establishment resources forcing us to contextualize ourselves into contextualized material that they would say is pure doctrine, but it's not actually pure. It's actually it's oftentimes racialized and contextualized to whoever's creating it. I will push back a little bit on the Christianity not being in Asia, because like as early as the 700s, you'll see traces of Christianity in China with Nestorian going out to China, and of course there are challenges there, and the bigger questions of like, okay, at what point do we say Christianity is in a place, if it's the majority or if it's a small remnant or a small number? In India, it's viewed that the Thomas was there, and so you have a whole population of Indians that have basically apostles as their apostolic last names.
Yes, that's
and then of course like you're talking about and this is a tricky reality where the Philippines, you're talking about colonialism, oftentimes bleeding and blending in with the Christian or Catholic faith, and from the 1500s. And so I think that there are rich histories of Christianity in Asia. I mean, like I'm 7th and 8th generation Christian, and our family was converted in Russia, from what I can understand, like 7 or 8 generations ago. And that's not common for a lot of, especially for Koreans. But like we've been able to track most clearly like 5 generations so far, 5 or 6 generations. And we hear echoes of 7 and 8 generations on each side. And so I'm like, okay, there's something there that God has been working in my own family line that I'm trying to not limit or diminish, but I also don't want people to kind of walk away saying, okay, just because an entire nation or an entire country normalized Christianity or became acceptable, that it wasn't there and things. And I know that that's not what you're saying.
I'm not saying it's not there. I think historically each country has treated Christianity differently. And you're right, Christian missionaries have gone to all the countries, including Japan, but they were severely squashed in Japan. In India, maybe they were more successful. I think there are countries that are more successful in I don't know what's the word, in infiltrating or embracing that culture. And Korea certainly is a very positive example. But I'm the first generation Christian on both sides. So when you ask me, this is what I see. I have no connection with anyone in either side of Christianness. So 7th, 8th generation, my goodness, that's incredible to me. Of course, I have studied history and I know there was always attempt to infiltrate and to go into Asia. But then some leaders suppressed it, others just sort of over time culturalized, so it doesn't exist. So again, it's so complex, it's hard to generalize. I think I'm just speaking more out of a sense of frustration that I'm the first one in my generation. I have to kind of do a lot of the work myself to create this Asian American identity, and I enjoy learning from others, but I have to be very honest, it's a very lonely journey for the most part.
Just as both of you were talking, it just stirred my man, I don't think we recognize how deeply infiltrated it is in our thinking of what's legitimate or what's real as an Asian American Christian. So this is embarrassing to share now, but I remember when we
Embarrass yourself. We love it.
because no one's going to see this, right? But I remember when we first started our church 15 years ago, one of our desires was to be a multi-ethnic church of reconciliation. It's always been. I'm still a big believer in that. This is terrible. I remember when we started, we didn't have my name or face anywhere on our website. Because as a new church, there was, and I didn't recognize until years later, like some of the factors behind it, like I felt like success was to be able to reach people who are not Asian. Somehow it's less to just ministrate it, but if you really want to be able to be effective with others, I am an impediment. And let's get them in here. Once they hear me preach, they're good, but I don't want to do anything. And I think as you talk about history and even different, too often we define success, and that's probably a great marker of discipleship, as what does success look like by the larger media, even as we talked from before. Who are the big conference speakers? Who's writing the books? And recognizing there's a whole system at play that perpetuates certain power systems here. But as Asian Americans sometimes, and we even see in our church, when we list off who are the best theologians or pastors, they'll name off probably a lot of the similar names because that's what's been put in front of them. And I think the great opportunity we have is not to diminish those other resources. They're great, but we also have been given a space as part of that. And that God will be fully known within our limits by recognizing as many of these different factors as much as possible. But yeah, I think we have to recognize some of what's considered legitimate or real. It's different factors at play.
Dan, I'd love to hear what kind of helped you sort of evolve out of that initial mindset, or what changed, or what's helped you now to look back and see things differently from those early days of your church website and how you approached your own Asian identity.
So yeah, I don't want to make this too much about me, but I think so we hit a point in our church for about the first 5 or 6 years, we were predominantly non-Asian. It was weird. And I kind of got a little questioning myself, like, what's wrong with me? I can't even reach my own people. But there were different factors there. But then for different reasons, we started to get a big influx of Asians. And I remember at a certain point, this is crazy, it's embarrassing, but I asked myself, what if we become too Asian? And talking with others, other Asian American leaders started realizing that's like a question that really only Asian Americans ask ourselves. No one else asks that. There's something inherently like, and I would say it's a product of the fall within us as Asians in America, where we just come from a position of automatic deficiency. And we've got to compensate. And for us to truly be accepted, assimilated, to be brought in, we can't be too Asian, whatever that means. And I think just having to, therapy was helpful, but having to walk through and be able to acknowledge what are some of the pains in my own history that have led me to view myself that way. And I would say for young Asian American women and men in our church, one of the formative aspects for them, honestly, is to be part of a multi-ethnic church, not because of the diversity necessarily, but to see people who are not Asian following Asian American leaders, including myself. Because outside of the church, you see that normally, but in the church, that's such a foreign concept for many. So yeah, it's been a whole journey.
Yeah, that's been great.
Embrace
that's
who I am.
Yeah. I right now this fall, we're preparing in our church to apply a theme for the upcoming ministry year that's focused on cross-cultural ministry. That's the language that we use in our church. And one of the, among other, but one of the priorities that we actually have is doing a better job of addressing the needs and perspectives of Asian American members of our church. And why? Because in the last couple of years, one of the loudest, respectful, but loudest and most consistent complaints or at least just perspectives that have been shared with me among our members, Asian American members, is that they feel, where's my place in this conversation? Where's my place in this church? Which is this tragic sort of humbling irony. Because I'm leading the church, the lead pastor of our church is an Asian American, and yet they feel like, well, and to be clear too, most of these people also will be quick to say they do support our focus and prioritization of our Black and Brown members and communities in our local area, because we are in a historically Black neighborhood. We are in a part of the city that has one of the larger Latin American communities here in DC. And we also are in a denomination that is in the process of repenting of its anti-Black racism as well. So for a number of reasons, there's good strategic and reasons of repentance for us to focus on Black and Brown communities as a church. So they support that, and yet it just raises all these ministerial and existential questions of how did we get here? How did I get here as a leader of the church? So just to follow your lead of some personal vulnerability as far as the challenge of leading Asian Americans in churches, even as an Asian American leader, and to do so in a way that actually honors the variety of ways in which we want to grow as a cross-cultural, multi-ethnic church. It's complicated. And because I think adding to everything that you've mentioned, Dan, and you, John, we need to name it, that culturally Asian American communities do have a bent towards assimilation, towards self-deprecation, towards deference. That's not all bad, and we need to be careful about overly casting that as a negative impulse. In the right setting, that's a good impulse. By setting, I actually mean in our original cultures. It works when the entire cultural ecosystem is built around a mutual, self-deprecating, deferring kind of dynamic. But when you're relocated into a dominant culture that is not that at all, then you become erased, then you become lost, then you become invisible, and that's precisely what has happened, and we have accepted that as a norm in the church as well. Whether if it's in trying to ingratiate ourselves to leaders in communities that are in dominance, or if it's in trying to find our way through institutions that are white-led, or if it's in adopting, knowingly, unknowingly, cultural norms that are non-Asian and trying to find our way through that. I think we are too often finding ourselves not just as erased, but self-erased, not just as invisible, but self-deprecating to the point of even being invisible to our own reflection in the mirror. We don't know who we are. How can we expect others outside of our community to know who we are?
That's right. That's good. Do you want to have a vulnerable moment too?
Oh yeah, sure. Since we'll be vulnerable. Well, we're a Chinese church. We don't apologize for that. And I think actually at this moment in American history, there are people who actually, they're Asian Americans who are actually looking for a church like ours. I think there was a trend for about 15 years where the young people wanted to exit ethnic churches, but they thought multicultural church was the way to go. Right. Yeah. But I have an issue with that. I think that model is created by white evangelicals, so that it's basically Asians go to our white evangelical churches because you will make us diverse. Why don't whites come to Asian churches? We have English services. Why should it be a one-way migration? And he's right. And I find some Asian Americans are not coming back because I think of this Asian hate. But I'll tell you, as a pastor, it was a very difficult period where people were like going to multi-ethnic churches and leaving. They thought they were moving ahead, growing beyond their just narrow Asian American identity. But I can understand it, especially when they're young. They need to just sort of test the other waters. Like people in California want to see the East Coast. These people in the East Coast want to go see the West Coast. There's something innate in young people wanting to explore the other side. But the critique they brought was that you guys are just all Asian. But they don't realize we are a very diverse Asian church. We have 3 languages, three different language services every Sunday. It's very hard to gel that together, let alone 3 cultures.
Right.
So I think we've had to withstand periods. I think we felt, boy, and even our church leaders, like we should be ashamed of ourselves that we're not attracting the young people. But I felt like this is my calling, you know. And if I only serve a particular group of people who finds our church to meet their needs, that's fine. There are other churches. I think we need all kinds of churches for all kinds of people. So I don't disparage other churches. I just feel like there should be a space and place for every kind of church. We need more churches, not less types of churches, because people are so diverse.
And it's really interesting on that thought. And this got me mad when I first heard it, but it was good. I get mad all the time. I get angry. But I remember at our church, we were probably about, at that point, maybe 60% Asian American. But then I heard from second, third hand from someone non-Asian who had been considering our church, who told someone else within our city, oh, they're an Asian church. I remember getting mad. I'm like, what the heck does that mean? We're not even like, but I think in kind of what John's even addressing, we have to recognize even outside of our own tribes, the way people will diminish what it means to be Asian. And that, again, there is a definition of, maybe it's self-driven, but it's also external. Like you can be, we want you to be Asian, but not too Asian. And even people, again, will determine success, determine where they can grow. Is this a place I can really be in community? And kind of disparage. So I've been encouraging our folks, all of, to celebrate how God has designed you to be. Don't apologize for it. Ask God to redeem who you are for the sake of his greater kingdom movement in making disciples.
And I think part of where that comes from really is it's a theological thing, meaning what does it look like for Asian Americans to recover an appropriate sense of pride in who they are? And by pride, I mean an appropriate sense of dignity, collective self-worth, a sense of belonging, right? Imago Dei. What does that look like? I think it starts with really believing and helping each other to believe that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that we are a people that have been gathered by God's providence in this country with a rich history and a complicated present and an uncertain future. We'll see how it's written, but one that is God made, meaning orchestrated by God and his grace. And it's something that we can be proud of, if I can use that language. And I think that's really important because most of us, at least in our generation, didn't grow up with that kind of pride. What would it look like? I ask this often of myself and my wife and I, we talk about this a lot as parents. What does it look like for us to raise our kids with the kind of sense of cultural pride that we didn't grow up with, so that you're not opening up your lunchbox with that sort of hesitancy or shame, right? Where you're not so, antsy about mom and dad speaking in another language in the elevator, right? Where you're actually like, I like being who I am. And again, not just because self-talk is the final grounding of my identity, just because I'm telling, no, God has told me God has told me that I am a unique reflection of who He is. So I think that's something we need to keep on discipling ourselves, each other, people in our churches and communities, into being able to stand tall about being Asian American. It's high time we do that.
Yes. You know, I like myself.
We like you too.
Well, praise God, right? You know, but I don't hate myself. I mean, but I sense a lot of our young people, so some hatred for themselves.
Yes.
But you shouldn't be hating it. God gave it to you. It's part of you, how you're made in this particular way. Don't hate yourself, right? I think I took time to get to that point, but the more confident you feel about how God has made you as a pastor, as a bridge to diverse, chasms that you could stand in the middle, then you can accept this is for this time, this place, this is my place, this is my role. You don't have to fulfill every role, but this is my role. And when you can accept that, then I think you have developed a healthy sense, you can like who you are. And then I think in your ministry, then you can reach out to others, people like you or not like you, and just treat each other like human, but with a particular uniqueness that they also have. You can respect them and like them for who they are too.
And I think it's such a powerful word, because, and I'm probably reflecting my own trauma here, but I think sometimes an overemphasis on just skipping to Genesis 3, and that all of discipleship is just identifying your sin and hating it, which we all agree that's good. But I think, obviously within even some Asian Americans I know, it's not just hating sin, but it's hating all of who you are. Like everything needs to be repented of, including anything that's related to your culture. And we got to start at the beginning. God's good creation, it's all part of His design. You are not a mistake. You have intentionally been, and it's good to acknowledge those things, always growing. But I think discipleship needs to be much more fully orbed, rather than just like these cookie cutter, here's the path and 6 steps towards a mature Christian. That doesn't address some of understanding God's good intent and design.
But I think the Bible, I know one of the questions is biblical examples. I think we're so fortunate. There are biblical examples of this way before we're walking this path. Think about Moses, Egyptian-born Jew. That would be like an American-born Korean or American-born Chinese. Imagine the complexity, and he was raised in the royal palace. Am I Jewish? Am I Egyptian? You're both. And he knew how to. It took time too, but eventually I think the critical point was he killed the Egyptian. Now that's a very dramatic way, but for him it was identifying as a Jew and the God of the Judaism. But he knew that Egyptian part, he was educated in the wisdom of Egypt. I think that served him well, because he will be the perfect bridge to lead his people out of Egypt into the promised land. That was God's role for him. And maybe when he was young, he struggled with, I was put in this Nile, I was floated down, I was going to be killed, but then God saved me. For why? Esther, for times such as this. And then I think in the New Testament, what was another? The Apostle Paul. He's like Jewish, but grew up in Tarsus. But eventually he was the person who was able to reconcile the Jew and the Gentile problem, break down that barrier, and he wrote about it in his letter. So people with 2 different cultural tensions, I think often are the people that God deliberately put there to bring different chasms to become a bridge maker.
Do you feel then, John, it sounds like you're saying that Asian Americans might have a unique role?
Oh, we have a very unique role. Maybe others don't recognize it. I recognize, I see myself as a bridge builder. Bridge builder between different Asian generations, between different Asian ethnicities, between Asian, a specific Chinese with America. So as I see myself as a bridge builder, I can fit anywhere, because my role is not tied to something, but I'm rooted in it. But it allows me, because I'm very confident in that rooting, I can reach out with security, with confidence, and without any fear about that, because this is who God made me.
And so I think it's amazing how God redeems the thing that were painful. So you guys are Southern California, so it's different, right? But for me,
I'm Chicago.
Oh, you're Chicago, sorry. But I grew up feeling I didn't fit anywhere.
Yeah.
I didn't know where I fit, and that's been a lifelong struggle. But then seeing, as God redeems that, the flip side of that, in Christ, you can fit everywhere. You're uniquely situated to be a missionary, to be a Paul in that sense. So the things that brought pain, even with that Asian American identity, I don't know my place. Maybe the place is you can fully be everywhere. And it's the Great Commission going forth.
And let me say though, that I think part of the challenge is if you can be everywhere, do you find yourself being nowhere? And so just to link this with what we were talking about before, as far as having a durable, conscious self-identity sort of in place, as far as understanding who I am, one of the dangers, or maybe not dangers, challenges, I think, of being a bridge is that you're bringing together two different bodies, but you yourself are only the conduit, but not you're not a third party in that conversation. You're just, you know, a good moderator isn't speaking the whole time. They're moderating and sort of provoking conversation and orchestrating conversation. So how do Asian Americans then, even as bridge builders, not simply become sort of invisible, again, moderators, although they might uniquely be able to bring different people together, if we haven't done sufficient work ourselves in knowing exactly who we are.
And I think that's why, as we are bridge builders and people of reconciliation, I'll be honest, I love spaces like this with other Asian Americans, because I think we need those places to remind us who we are. And it's not a detriment, even if we hear voices, to recognize, no, it's good, and to be around some people who, even in our differences, kind of get some of the same common things, and we don't have to work so hard at it to continue to feed us for the great work of, so it's like living in all of those different spaces. But yeah, I love times where not having to apologize for it. I like being around other Asian American leaders, other Korean. It's good. Right. Reminds me of who I am and what God has done.
Yeah, kind of keeping the door open, and I'm going to uninvisibilize myself as the moderator as I bring us home. But I mean, I think that's in part why, you know, I think for me, in addition to you know, the advocacy work and trying to mobilize the Asian American Christian community, AACC, as I've worked in like white evangelical Christian higher education spaces and white evangelical churches and so on and so forth, it was like my sanctuary, so I can kind of somewhat be sane, you know. And so I think one of the challenges of being in spaces where you're constantly the bridge is that you're always being walked on and stepped on, and so you're making these connections, but then at some point you also need a home to rest your head in, or, you know, a community to kind of go back home to. And so that's what I've found is like, okay, I can do this work where I'm getting recharged in one space so that I can go and expend energy in another space. And I don't know where I would be without the work that we're doing with Asian American Christian Collaborative. Personally, I don't know where I would be. I think I'd be in a different place.
I think we need places where we feel it's home, and we don't need to explain ourselves, and we don't need to be bridges. But there are also public spaces when we are called upon to be bridge for a time, for a purpose. But that's not our only identity. So otherwise you will always be stepped on, or, you know, carry the weight of both sides. I've been serving in my Chinese Bible church for 34 years. This is my 34th year, one church. That's my home.
Praise God.
I'm very secure there. It's given me a lot of the strength I think I need to be able to be a bridge, because I'm very solidly rooted in my own community. And then I have my own family. I have 3 kids, they're all grown on their own. I'm very secure in terms of how they're doing and how they're turning out. So I don't need to worry about that. So when I go home, I'm just me. I don't need to be a bridge to, you know, other groups except for my wife. But then, you know, at church, I'm just who I am. I preach in the English service, but I know people in other congregations, but I don't preach there. So I think maybe most of the time we need places in which we're called, it's our home. We cannot be bridges all the time. We cannot exist in a diverse world all the time. There are times we need places in which there's more homogeneity than there are diversity. We cannot exist totally in a diverse world, because we have certain particularities that are unique to us. And if we can find places in which those can rest safely, it will enable us to go out on those occasions when we need to be bridges.
And I think part of what you're doing there is making a good case for why Asian American churches have great value, why
value.
English ministries, EM communities have important value, not just for themselves, but even in the work of venturing out, of bringing people together, of reconciliation, and so on and so forth, right?
This is great. Well, we got to wrap up our time together. We have like 50 other questions that we could have dove into, but I do want to kind of leave us with one final question, anyway, a 1 minute answer. But looking to the future, what would you hope to see in terms of the integration of Asian American identity into the fabric of Christian discipleship? How can the church evolve to better support, because we're talking about multi-ethnic churches, we're talking about Asian, and one of the kind of the most startling statistics that we'll be kind of sharing at some point is how the majority of Asian Americans are not at Asian American churches. So we're the only population, the only racial group where we are not with our own. Now, on the one hand, we can articulate that, okay, we're the ones that are doing the bridge building, but in the same time as we're bridge building, we're essentially entering into a form of self-erasure, and we're not just being invisible. We're not just invisible. We're being invisibilized to the point where even like the things that you're talking about, Duke, those kind of conversations are emerging. At the same time, there's about a third of churches seem to have closed during the pandemic, and Asian American churches are not exempt from that, and so there's less of those, and so there's almost a like what's happening within the Asian American population. So, what are your hopes in terms of integration of Asian American identity into the fabric of Christian discipleship, and how can the church evolve regardless of the church? Because there's Asian American churches, there's ethnic specific churches, there's multi-ethnic churches, there's white churches, and the majority of Asian Americans attend white churches. They don't really attend non-white churches, to engage with the diverse experience of its members.
Yeah, I think part of what's on my heart is for Asian American communities, Asian American Christian communities and churches specifically, to do more of addressing the unique and particular needs of Asian American Christians themselves, meaning that what defines you is not just a broad sense of identity, so you come together because it's people that look like you and you're just more intuitively comfortable there, but the content of your ministry or the programming of your ministry is essentially generic, right? I mean, can we do a better job of actually addressing the uniquely Asian American traumas that people have grown up with? Do our counseling ministries actually speak into that kind of grief and recovery? Are we talking about intergenerational struggles explicitly from the pulpit? Are we talking about things like what we just talked about here, the silence and invisibility? Is this being spoken about in the pews, in their small group ministries? Are we training people with a hermeneutical lens that gives them a sense of, hey, I can see things that maybe some of my peers in other churches can't see? So there's more Asian American contextualization and specificity in the details of ministry that are applied, that then also help to give a broader sense of why these ministries are so needed, so valuable, and again, a gift not only to the Asian American community, but more broadly. That's one thought that's on my heart. If I can slip in one other, we've talked a lot about the importance of sort of breaking out of sort of this assimilationist mindset. How do we actually see ourselves as unique, distinct, and being okay with some of that, not simply diving into the waters of the majority culture? I do think it's important for Asian American Christian ministries and institutions, however, to not then give in to assimilationist strategies of achieving that end. And what I mean by that is, how do we still be ourselves? Because we look around and we say, well, okay, we need to step up. So that means we need to speak louder. As long as that's true to who we are. We need to be more publicly, politically engaged. Activism is the answer. As long as that's true to who you are. I'm concerned that we don't see the future of Asian American Christianity of simply adopting the tools and means of other communities that are authentic to them in a way that's not authentic to us, assuming that that's the answer to the promised land of Asian American authentic Christian identity? What if it's okay for certain aspects of our cultural expression of Asian American Christian faith to be more quiet, to be more marginal, to be less white, to be less black, to be just who we are, to make peace with that while still challenging that? And I don't have the answer to that, but I'm concerned that we're even too quick to adopt the strategies and tactics that have worked for other communities that may not be best for us.
Yeah, it's another analogy, right? Maybe we should think of a family, right? David had how many brothers? 6, 7, right? He was the puny one, the last one, right? Maybe Asian Americans are like David. We're the last one. The older brothers, by that I mean other Christians who've been Christians for a longer time. They're the older brothers, whether Orthodox, Catholic, Presbyterians, Lutherans. Asian Americans are the young sibling that is easily ignored because we are young and small, which is in families. You know, if you have 7 kids, and the youngest one tends to be personality-wise quieter and smaller and not cry, guess what? The natural reaction, everybody will ignore them until they grow up and communicate. Hey, I'm here, right? Because the natural tendency, everybody said, oh, look at me, look at me. So I think when you talked about what is true to ourselves, I mean, nobody likes to think of themselves as being ignored, but the reality is, if you think about the Christian family as a whole, Asian Americans tend to be the last born. Okay, but the scripture says the last shall be first, the first shall be last. We have something we can contribute, but we need to recognize that we are later to the game, pay due respect to the older brothers, but then when it's time for us to speak, and I think Asian American, as it's maturing and growing, we will be able to speak that, hey, I can also join the conversation. I can bring something to this that maybe you have overlooked. So if we think of it as a family, then maybe that will help us to understand where we are and where we can go.
You hear what John just said? He said, one day we're going to be king.
Yeah, sure, why not? Well, we'll see how the Lord deals with that.
Yeah, one final thing I would throw in there is just been a passion of mine is greater health overall, because I think the American dream is you achieve this and you're going to be whole, even within Christian cultures. And more Asian Americans I'm walking with, even generational trauma and sin. And you know, usually sins of the father we think as a charismatic kind of deliverance thing, but I think more and more I've been studying, we're carrying stuff we're not even recognizing, and that's an area that I want to continue to see that people coming behind me would be much healthier than I was as we go forward.
Well, thanks for all that you've shared. Lots to chew on and lots to continue to chew on, and so hopefully this won't be the last. Great to be together.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Red.